أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من اللعين الغوي الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الميامين المهديين المقتولين ولعنة الله دائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقال الله تعالى في كتابه المجيد: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الذي يريكم البرق خوفا وطمعا وينشئ السحاب الثقال. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على. I want to explore today a little bit about how we arrived in the present situation that we're in. What were the things that had to happen, or didn't had to happen, but happened rather, in order for us to arrive in a world in which, from being virtually impossible to not believe in God, or to not have one's life shaped by God, the presence of God, to a world in which it's simply an option, and even if it is an option, it's an embattled option, it's a struggled option, it's sometimes often a mocked option in life. This process of how insan arrived in this current situation is about a 500-year history, give or take. But there's another very important point that I want to bring to your attention, mu'mineen. This is not a Muslim problem. This is a problem with Christianity. This is not a Muslim problem, this whole issue of divorcing oneself from God and having a grand reformation and all of this. This is not a problem that Muslims experience per se. This is a problem that Christianity went through, and Muslims migrated to majority Christian countries and then found themselves embroiled in a society and in a culture that is completely alien to the Islamic ethos and Islamic world. That's the truth of the matter, really. I mean, it is what it is. That the grievances that led to modern secularism, or the modern world in which we are in, is a product of specific battles and arguments and discussions and reformations and discourses that arose out of a Christian framework, in Christianity, not Islam. So Muslims have to be careful not to have something called Stockholm Syndrome. Who's ever heard of the word Stockholm Syndrome? It's basically where someone's kidnapped, and after so long, the kidnapped one identifies with the kidnapper. Right? Like they have those movies, right, where the person is kidnapped and somehow along the way falls in love with the kidnapper. This is called Stockholm Syndrome. Muslims have to be careful not to fall into Stockholm Syndrome, right? And not to project other people's problems that they have with their religion and their church, and I'm not even saying whether those are right or wrong. I'm just saying it's a totally different world, right? So then Muslims moved here either as refugees or looking for economic employment or for better education for their children. For whatever reason is, they came to these countries, Canada, America, Australia, so on and so forth, France, Netherlands, fine. But then they probably should know, we should know what it is that we're walking into. We're already here now. There's no going anywhere. So I think it's important to understand 2 points. 2 points I think are vital to understand here. Point number one is, how did the West get to this point? right? Because when you understand the historical trajectory of how they arrived at something, then you begin to understand why it is the way it is today, and how not to fall into certain traps in terms of ways of thinking. For example, we asked the question, how did the Muslim community allow Hussein ibn Ali to be killed on the 61st year of Hijrah? We have to go back to Saqifa. That's the reality. You have to go back to it to understand that certain decisions, actions, and attitudes of people that paved the way for the death of Imam Hussein, right? It's called, you know, a forensic debrief, or whatever you want to call it. It's called a look in the rearview mirror. Because when you look back, you understand the present in terms of the past. And when you understand the present in terms of the past, you develop, an appreciation of your current situation, and you develop better strategies on how to deal with it. Right? And this is something that Islam emphasizes to us again and again and again. So, the I don't know what we would want to call it, the pre-secular world, before all of this kind of collapsed, the world of human beings was built on 3 pillars. And I would say Islam, or the life of a healthy Muslim, is built on these 3 pillars. 3 pillars. Pillar number 1, and this is not in any particular order. It's very important that we understand this and our children understand this, because these are fundamental ways of looking at the world. Number 1, the natural world is enchanted by the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That while there are scientific causes, there are scientific causes for many things. But ultimately, it is an act of God. And that's why Allah says, هُوَ الَّذِي يُرِيكُمْ الْبَرْقَ خَوْفًا وَطَمَعًا. That He is the one who shows you the lightning as a form of fear and hope when you see it. That when you see the lightning in the sky, Allah says it instills within us a fear of tama'an wa khawf. Khawfan wa tama'an, rather. Fear and hope. It's a very deep concept, right? Because what is reflected outside is one of 2 things. One, you don't want to get hit by lightning. Nobody wants to get hit by it. But on the other hand, you need it in order for what it does to the earth and so on and so forth. It's telling you that rain is coming, and it also is a form of fertilization, right? There are positive effects, but there's also negative effects of lightning, right? And it inspires within the human being both fear and hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, in the macrocosm, in the outside world, the human being is looking at lightning with fear, both fear and hope, right? And inside they live their life with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in between fear and hope, between fear of being punished and the hope of being saved. So the outside reflects the inside reflects the outside. For the mu'min, for the believer, there is no contradiction between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the outside and the inside, between the zahir and the batin. There is no contradiction. It is one existence. And that one existence has one Lord and one sovereign and one king and one Malik, and that's Malik Yawmiddin. The Malik and the only sovereign of the Day of Judgment and the sovereign of all. And it is important, and you know, and this may seem, I mean, sometimes some of this may seem very simple, but it's really not simple. Because I tell you, how many of us think of lightning when we see it in that way? This is what Allah tells us about lightning in the Quran. Or we just kind of it just passes over us. These things are meant to instill certain things within us. Right? There are verses in the Quran about this. And all of this working, all of these operations, Allah has created the Imam at the center of it. I don't want to go too much into this depth of wilaya and things maybe some brothers may, but the imam is the cause or the illah of all of this. Allah has created him as the cause. So for example, we read in the traditions that whatever goodness happens to mu'mineen, whatever good that comes to a believer, the very fact that we continue to exist today as believers is not because of us. Ultimately, it's because of the presence of the imam. It is his very wujud and his very presence that is the, I don't want to use philosophical language, is the cause of existence. But there are other more appropriate words to use, but this is not a class of Islamic philosophy or theology. But this is very important, because this is what is the basis of our relationship with Sahib al-Zaman. This is why when we turn to him and we say, Assalamu alayka ya Sahib al-Asri wa Zaman, when we turn to him on the day of Ashura and all of these things, we realize that we're not just turning to an ordinary person, that the hujjat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is at the very center of the symphony of creation that Allah has created, of this beautiful cosmos and universe. The center is the imam of the time. This is how Allah has created it. And number two, so number one is the cosmos, the universe is the theater of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the amazing things that we see are acts of God, ultimately. They may have natural causes, plate tectonics, so on and so forth, whatever, air pressure, humidity, so on and so forth. Fine, yes. But ultimately, they are acts of God. And we should believe them that they are acts of God. And we should teach our children that these are acts of God. Now, they're not going to learn that in school. So already they're handicapped in a way, intellectually and spiritually. Because imagine going to school for your entire life and no one ever telling you that that's an act of God. In a succinct, beautiful, spiritual, rational way. And you're just raised in that godless, empty realm of information. And they call it nature. So it's kind of hard to cultivate a spiritual existence when, when we're put in the midst of this. And this is another reason why Islamic schools are so important, but we'll talk about that another night. Number two, any form of authority, any form of government, any form of responsibility ultimately derives from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. بيده الملك تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. That every position of authority, this is vital. These are three cardinal things that every Muslim should know. Every position of authority, whether it be a father in the household, whatever it may be, the president of the center, the mayor of a town, the president of a country, whatever it is, any kind of wilaya or authority ultimately derives from God and is responsible towards God. Anything. Now imagine a world in which the responsibility to a higher power is removed from the equation. It's not to say that human beings will necessarily be unjust. No. I think that is an unfair and unqualified statement to make. But it certainly changes the equation drastically. So when people in authority are truly not responsible to a higher power, and the society collectively holds them responsible not to the society but to God. Think about this. So number two was the second piece of the puzzle, or the second block of that Jenga that was pulled out. Number one was pulled out when they took God out of the universe, basically, saying, look, God created, he's as good as, na'udhu billah, maybe in the words of Thomas Hume or something, in the words of Hume, he's as good as like winding up a clock. He wound it up, got it started, and let it go. Everything else is off to random chance and cause and effect, and that's it. And there isn't any meaning to this universe. It's bereft of meaning. There isn't any meaning. It's like taking, I think it was it Eliot who said this? I don't remember now. But it's like taking pieces of paper, ripping them up, and throwing them in the wind, and wherever they land, that's the extent of your life, and that's the meaning, and get over it. And God may have created the paper, but he doesn't really care where any of the pieces of paper land. Welcome to modernity. And our kids are, well, actually they've even removed the whole God part at the beginning completely, so that's not even a part of it anymore. Now imagine you have children raised for 12 years on that, plus 4 years of university, so that's what, 12 plus 4, 16 if they're in daycare or kindergarten, another 2 or 3 on there. So what are we at now? 12 plus 4, 16. We're at about 17 years of their life. They are ingrained in that philosophy of the world, drilled into them from as old as they can speak. And then they go to a Sunday school for 1 hour a week. 2 hours a week, you think that's going to unwind? It's not. It's a losing battle. Number 3 is human beings live in an enchanted world. There are unseen beings around us. There are angels, there are jinn, there are spirits, there are souls that visit us. This is a reality that these metaphysical realities or ghaibiyat, they exist, they're real. They're not fairy tales, they're not myths. Right? There's alamul shahada and alamul ghaib. There's the world that is seen and the world that is unseen. Every religious tradition believes in the seen and the unseen world. Now again, imagine 17 years of your life being inundated day in and day out with, at the very least, only one small segment of reality being shown to you. At the least, or at the worst, one small segment of reality at the expense of anything else existing, meaning that nothing else exists, this is all that exists. Let's go best case scenario that they are indifferent towards other alternative realities, but there's no exposure to it. And to the fundamental rational basis of believing in something that is unseen. That there's fundamental reasons to believe in unseen. Our consciousness is unseen, isn't it? The fact that you know that you are here, can you see that? No. Each and every one of you are having a spiritual experience right in this moment. And that spiritual experience is unseen, it's ghaibi. It's unseen. You can't find it. So how do you know you exist? This is very simplified. We teach this over an entire seminars and courses and semesters, years and years and years. But if Muslims are not interested in this kind of education, then they're just going to be lambs led to the slaughter. Simple as that. They are just fresh meat. That is the reality. This is the fundamentals of our religion. Arkanuddin. The fundamentals, the pillars of our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Yawm al-Ma'ad and the day of return. We believe in jinn. We believe that they exist. When we read Surah Falaq, we take it seriously. When we read it to our children at night, we don't tell it to them like it's some kind of fairy tale. When we read Surah Nas, every night before I put my little one to bed, we read Nas and Falaq. Reminding her that there is evil out there. There are unseen forces in this world. They can do harm, possibly, if the human being is not careful. Amir al-Mu'mineen, rather Imam Hussein, what does he say in Dua Arafah? وَكَلَأْتَنِي مِن طَوَارِكَ الْجَانِ. That, oh Allah, when I was a baby in my cradle, you protected me from the jinn. So the jinn even tried to hurt the baby in the cradle. Would we deny that Hussein ibn Ali, na'udhu billah, did, like, what is he talking about? As parents, do we take these threats seriously, or are we more worried about COVID? Not saying not to be worried about it. We have to be concerned with the physical health of our children, 100%. Do we take Surah Nas and Surah Falaq seriously? What we read in there? Min sharri ghasiqin idha waqab. That in the night there is evil. When darkness falls, there is forces out there that if the person is not on prayer, not giving sadaqah, not taking care of their iman, they are susceptible to these things. We believe in this. This is a truth. This is a part of our religion. It's part of our deen. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a myth. Even the word myth is in religious studies doesn't mean what it means here, but for the layman's term, myth we'll use. It's not a myth. It's not a myth. These are metaphysical realities that have metaphysical proofs and reasonable proofs that have been articulated over 1,000 years. But if human beings are not bothered to learn about it, how can they reject it? As Guy Eaton says something so interesting. He's such a tremendous scholar, Guy Eaton. He wrote a book called King of the Castle, Choice and Responsibility in the Modern World. Eaton says something so interesting. He says that the little toad at the bottom of the well, just because he can't be bothered to know or to get out of the well in order to see what the peak of the mountain looks like, does that mean that the peak of the mountain doesn't exist? If we want to be toads at the bottom of the well and live our life at the very basics, who are we to reject that the height of the peak of the mountains exists? It is only the sheer arrogance and self-entitlement and laziness and kasal and ghafla of insan and laziness and heedlessness. There's no other excuse. To deny metaphysical realities without even understanding what those metaphysical realities are, or to not take them seriously without even bother to understanding what they are to begin with. But this is the world in which we live. So these three elements, the enchantment of nature, the fact that all power ultimately comes from God and is responsible towards God, and number three, that this universe has forces within it, unseen forces, that can affect us in different ways, positively or even negatively. These three things were fundamental elements of human civilization. Fundamental. Even for idol worshippers or monotheists, these three things were the bedrock of human existence, of how humans understood themselves. They understood their relationship with their family, with their loved ones, with animals, with their environment, with their government, with their society, with everything was understood on the basis of these three fundamental principles. Modernity took a battering ram to all three. In the words of Rob Dreher, he says something so interesting. This is an amazing book. It's called The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. I don't subscribe to everything he says in here. It's just some very interesting points that he brings up. He says here, our scientists, our judges, and our princes, our scholars, and our scribes. This is in the current age. They are at work demolishing the faith, the family, gender, and even what it means to be human. Our barbarians have exchanged animal pelts and spears of the past for designer suits and smartphones. They've exchanged animal pelts for suits and smartphones, and taken a battering ram to everything that has given human beings meaning since probably as long as we know, as humans have existed, as long as we have records. I mean, even the ancient Egyptians had these beliefs. I mean, we're even far from polytheism. And these three things I mentioned have to be the fundamental of a family, the bedrock upon which we raise our children. Nothing can come before it. And as Rob Dreher says, and if a price has to be paid, a price has to be paid. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. We want comfort and we want these three principles. There's going to come a time, or maybe there is a time, or maybe that time may come, may not, but very often that time does come where we can't have those three and the comfort that we want. Then what will we do? He asks a question in the context of Christians, but we can ask Muslims the same question. Are they ready to make hard choices for them and their children and their grandchildren and their family? Maybe move somewhere else. For him, in the case within America, maybe live within smaller knit communities where they can reinforce each other's values, homeschool their children, or come up with some other kind of system with 4 or 5, 6, 7 other families of the same values as them. Because if they lose these three things, what is the bedrock of their life to be built upon? Will their children's friends share those same three fundamental values? Their wives' friends and husbands' friends share the same three fundamental values. Let us not kid ourselves. Every interaction matters. Every interaction matters. And if we don't think it matters, we are only fooling ourselves, and we are in a state of complete and utter ghurur and delusion. This is not my words. I mean, these are Nasser, Dreher, William Chittick, David Bentley Hart. These are some of the most prominent, important thinkers of our age. At Yale, at different universities, who have the courage to write these kinds of books. I don't know, do Muslims have this kind of courage? Maybe Muslims don't have the privilege that Christians do, that's also true. But some of these Christians have a lot of guts to come out and say it, and then even get the book published by Yale. So Muslims, please, my dear Muslim brothers and sisters, my dear mu'mineen and mu'minat, don't be apologists. As Rob Dreher says something else so fascinating in the first chapter, he says we can't give them what we don't have. We have to make a choice of what we can give and what we really can't give at the end of the day. And then we don't have to live in that anxiety once we've set our red lines. But a lot of us, day to day, I know, are living in between those red lines, or close to it, for one reason or another. And again, and I'll mention again, it's very important, this whole crisis has nothing to do with Islam. This is a Christian problem. This is not a Muslim problem, my dear brothers and sisters. So please do not think this is a problem with Islam. This came out of a problem that Christians had over 500 years with the church, starting with Martin Luther and the Renaissance and all of that. And we're not going to go through that. I mean, for that, you can attend, a class on the history of modernism. This has nothing to do with us. So we don't need to adopt other people's problems or be the casualties of their sins. We don't need to inherit the sins of the Christian church or what is perceived to be sins. I'm not here to sit over judgment of them. I'm not a Christian. That's a conversation for them to have. But why do our kids have to suffer? because they have a problem with God and identity and all these other things, and lust and marriage and all these other things because of celibacy and all this other stuff which Islam doesn't believe in, which Islam is not a part of our religion. We need to teach our children this, and we need to teach it to them now. We need to teach it to them now, and we need to teach them to not be apologetic, not to be rude, not to be belligerent. People are either our brethren in faith or our likeness in humanity, but ultimately to know where they stand. You know, I met a brother who missed the day of Ashura. I will not forget this day, honestly. And I asked the brother, I said, I didn't see you on the day of Ashura, brother. Why? What happened? He said that I've been working for my company for like 20 years and they still don't know I'm a Muslim. I'm like, you're in the executive. How do they not know you're a Muslim? Because he's afraid to tell them. What will be the consequence? Maybe I'll hate my job. Maybe I'll lose my job. I don't know. I'm like, did they show any hatred towards Islam? No. But, you know. So I'm like, you missed the day of Ashura for that? Because you didn't have the courage to tell your boss that you need the day off? I mean, that's called just literally having no backbone. And if we stand a chance at surviving the battering ram and onslaught of this complete immorality, then we have to at least decide what our red lines are. And then we have to be ready to also hear the response, whether it's positive or negative. Of course, there's limits to this. There's times of taqiyya with people's life and things are at risk. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about slight discomforts may occur. Maybe a demotion at work. God forbid. I'm not wishing that on anyone. I'm just saying that if it comes between loving our imam and going to bed at night knowing that we did the right thing, and maybe living on 20% less, and 20% less square footage, or 50% less square footage, and our kids have to share a room instead of having their own room with an ensuite, is it worth it? Or maybe in cities like Miami or Toronto, settling on a condo or an apartment instead of a home. Because homes are exorbitantly expensive. We know that. You got to take like $1 million mortgage minimum to get in, if you even get approved at $1 million mortgage now. So settle for a condo. Kids got to share. Okay, if it's girl and boy, they might get a little difficult after bulugh. There are exceptions, of course. But are we ready to make these choices? But when we go to sleep at night, we can wake up in the morning and stand on our musalla and stand in front of God and honestly tell God from the bottom of our heart that I've tried my very best. I've pulled out all the stops with my kids. I've given them every opportunity to love Allah and His Messenger and the Ahlul Bayt. I've given them my heart. And I've made every opportunity to do the same. Can we, each and every one of us, stand on our musalla and say that? Inshallah we can. I'm not saying you can't or I can't. But these are the nights of Ayam Azza. If we're not going to do muhasabah in these nights and reflect over ourselves in these nights, then I don't know what this is the time to do it. Tomorrow, we'll continue more on this subject, but there are 3 elements that contributed to the destruction of those 3 fundamental things that I already mentioned: art, music, and political activism. You may be thinking, what do these 3 have to do with that? Tomorrow we will see. But I'll just drop you one little hint. And when you understand what art, the influence of art, music, and literature, or even political movements have had on the shaping of why people believe what they believe today, it will send, it sends shivers down my spine. Let me just share with you one example. In 1910, Virginia Woolf, the famous author, wrote, on or about December 1910, human nature changed. That the change of human nature, or the attempt to change human beings in the way they see the world, began in the early 20th century. And one of the landmark moments was André Gide. He was a French author. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He did a film in 1920 where he basically said, I am who I am. We don't need to define what he's talking about here. And there is no contradiction between morality and this way of life, because human beings define morality for themselves. And he basically said that anyone who does not express whatever lust is in their heart is only hurting themselves. You have to be yourself, he says. He was probably the most epic French author of the 20th century. He's had an incredible impact on European literature. And he was lived one of the most despicable, lustful lives. I won't even describe what he did because there are children here. We don't want to use certain terminologies that are not appropriate for them. He is the most celebrated, this is not he's a Nobel laureate. If the Nobel Prize in 47 is going towards such a deranged, sick, deluded, perverted individual, what does that tell you about society? And Sayyid Sistani should have a Nobel Peace Prize? Who cares? He didn't want one. What is the meaning in this Nobel Prize? If it's given in 47, in Atlantic Monthly, 1947 review in The Atlantic, it says, experience then is its own reward. It may be compared to a slightly overripe fruit in which after eating through the pulp, part of it is sweet, part of it is unpalatable. One reaches a core of pure goodness. Meaning, whatever you want to experience, just experience it. Nothing should hold a human being back from expressing their desires. Nothing. And if anything holds them back, that is a form of violence against the human being. This is in 47. Combine that now with other forces. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Art, literature, music. On every front, human beings were hit with this. Do what you want. Live your life. If anyone tells you, tell them to get lost. They use other words we obviously won't use from the member of Rasulullah. This is in 47. What about 2023? This is 1947. Just following on the heels of the end of the Second World War. These people were winning literature prizes in Europe. I mean, these were equivalent of novelist rock stars. And when we send our kids into the belly of that curriculum, we're going to have angels turn out the other end? Malaika are going to be popped out, are going to be produced? Mukhlisin are going to be produced? No. Because it's rotten at its core. The very core is fasid and rotten. The very core of the ulum and the sciences are problematic itself. Unless we teach them at home, we supplement at home. Yes, there's hope. We supplement with our children, we teach them what's right and wrong. Yes. But it just requires us to be a lot more present. We can't take things for granted like we would in other societies where those three principles that I began with are a given. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And it is on this day that we remember one of those children that truly had the peak of ma'rifat. The peak of ma'rifat, the peak of the gnosis of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the knowledge of Allah azza wa jal. This young boy swore to protect his uncle. This young boy told his uncle that death is sweeter to me than honey. Imagine raising, inshallah, we raise our sons to be like this. We raise our sons and our daughters to have this slogan, that death is sweeter to me than honey, when it's in the way of the Imam, in the way of the Ma'asum. He says, لا يقتل عمي وأنا أحمل السيف. That my uncle will not be killed as long as I am carrying a sword. The riwayat say that he now saw his uncle alone. Qasim saw Abu Abdullah all by himself. وَلَمَّا رَأَى وَحْدَةُ عَمِّي. And when he saw his uncle all alone, he began to ask permission from Imam al-Hussein to go out to fight. Imam denies him permission because he's too small. He continued asking for permission. Khawarizmi reports that the boy was about 13 years old. Abu Abdullah looked at Qasim alayhi salam, salamullahi alayhima, and he began to cry. Do you know why? He began to cry because this boy was an amanat in his hands. It's one thing to sacrifice Ali Akbar, because that's his son. But to sacrifice his brother's son is something else altogether. And that's why it says, يَبْكِيَانْ حَتَّى غُشِيَ عَلَيْهِمَا, that they both began to cry so much that they fainted. Imam Hussein fainted, Qasim fainted. Imagine the tears of Qasim and his uncle, salamullahi alayhima. Imagine the throne of Allah shaking at the tears of Hussein ibn Ali. Eventually, Hussein allowed Qasim to go out to fight. And the riwayah says, يُقَبِّلُ يَدَيْ وَرِجْلَيْ. And he began to kiss the hands, he began to kiss the feet of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Again, look at the reverence of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Qasim begins to kiss the feet. He goes out into battle. The riwayat state that he could not put on chainmail, according to most of the history. And he had slippers on, and he ran out into battle with slippers, with two slippers, but he couldn't fit into the armor for men. And he came out, and his tears were still falling onto his face, brothers. Take your heart to Karbala. Salamu alayka ya Abu Abdullah. Take your heart to Al-Baqi. Take your salam to Imam Hassan alayhi salam. He says that if you reject me, know that I am the descendant of Hassan. Sibtul Nabi al-Mustafa al-Mu'tamani. That I am from the grandchildren of the Prophet. This ghulam and this young boy had so much courage. But my heart is terrified to tell you what would happen next. He was too young to ride a horse. He was running out in slippers. One of the sandals, one of the strings on his sandal broke. He bent down to fix it. Imagine he's now walking barefoot on those burning sands. His feet must be entirely burning. Assalamu alayka ya Hassan al-Mujtaba. Seeing this young boy occupied, Umar bin Sa'id bin Nafid said that, Wallah, I'm going to kill this boy. Hamid bin Muslim, now hearing this in disgust, says, Subhanallah, ma turidu bidhalik. Why do you want to do this? Hamid bin Muslim tries to interfere at this point. He says, what do you want with this little boy? They begin to surround this little boy. وَوَقَعَ الْغُلَامِ لِوَجْهِهِ فَقَالَ يَا عَمَّا. Oh my uncle, oh my uncle. He falls onto his face. They begin attacking him from every side. They begin to cut him with their swords. We don't know what it is, just complete chaos. Qasim falls onto his face. Sword after sword after sword. فَجَلَّ الْحُسَيْنِ كَمَّ يُجَلِّي الصَّقَرِ. Hussein salamullahi alayhi comes out like a lion. This is one of the only times we read in the traditions. Hussein is roaring like a lion into the battlefield. He's looking for his nephew. The battle breaks out. The dust settles. And the riwayah says, Hussein reaches Qasim. Waqifan, and he's standing over him. Wa Aba Abdullah. Hussein is like an angry lion. He's fighting people left and right. Left and right, he's fighting people to try to get to Qasim. But it was too late. The hooves and the feet of the horses trampled the body of Qasim. And Hamid says, رَأَيْتُ الْحُسَيْنَ وَقَائِمًا عَلَى رَأْسِ الْغُلَامِ. And I saw Hussein standing over the head of the boy, and his little legs were just sticking out on the ground. And he says, عَدَّ لِقَوْمٍ قَتَلُوكَ وَمَنْ خَصَمُهُمْ يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ فِيكَ جَدَّكَ. And he says that your grandfather will be their enemy on the day of judgment. This is the dua of Hussein ibn Ali salamullahi alayhi. He says, far be the nation that have killed you. Your grandfather will be their enemy on the day of judgment. And he says, it is so hard on your uncle that تَدْعُوهُ فَلَا يُجِيبُكَ. You cried upon him and he could not answer you. Think of the broken heart of Hussein ibn Ali salamullahi alayhi. Or if he could answer you, he is now of no help to you. Think of the helplessness of Hussein ibn Ali. Wallah kathura watira wa qilla nasira. He says our enemies are so many, but our allies are so few, our helpers are so few. Salamullahi alayhi. Abu Abdullah now carries the lifeless body of his nephew, holding him to his chest. This is one of the rare examples where Hussein ibn Ali himself is carrying the child. Imagine Hussein is already thirsty. He's carrying the child. The riwayah says that his feet are bouncing up and down on the sand because Hussein is dragging him on the sand towards the tent. Qasim's legs are dragging. Hussein is now exhausted at this point. Hamid bin Muslim says, but now he says, I saw something very strange that I don't understand. وَدَعَ صَدْرُهُ إِلَى صَدْرِهِ. That he took his chest and held it to his chest. He says, I did not understand what is going on between them. The lifeless body of Qasim is being embraced by the broken heart of Hussein ibn Ali salamullahi alayhi. وَرَفَعَ صُرَاخُهُ إِلَى السَّمَاءِ. And Hussein begins to scream towards the heavens. Allahumma ahsihim adada. وَلَا تُغَادِرْ مِنْهُمْ أَحَدًا. Oh Allah, count every one of them. Oh Allah, do not leave any one of them alone. وَلَا تَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ أَبَدًا. And never forgive them, oh Allah. This is the screams of Hussein ibn Ali towards the heavens. Sabran ya bani umumati, sabran ya ahle bayti. He says, oh my family, have patience now. He says that you won't see too much hardship from this day. La'natullahi alaykum adh-dhalimin. Assalamu ala juyub al-mudarrajat. Peace be upon those chests that are stained in blood. Assalamu ala shifa'i dhabilat. Peace be upon the lips that are cracked from thirst. Assalamu ala nufus al-mustalimat. Peace be upon those souls that were stolen and taken away. La'natullahi alaykum adh-dhalimin. Matima Hussein.